The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com. The Byte Show is sponsored by Deep Cello Coffee, perhaps the best coffee on this or any other planet.
Hello, everybody. This is GeorgeAnn Hughes, and this is The Byte Show. And it's a real blessing, believe me, to have Joseph P. Farrell with us. And please visit Joseph's website. It is Giza, Giza, deathstar.com. Please notice the PayPal button on Dr. Joseph P. Farrell's website. And as many of our listeners know, Joseph P. Farrell is a brilliantly gifted researcher, and he is a highly prolific author. And he holds a doctorate in patristics from the University of Oxford and has published also 4 previous works, all on theology. And if you're interested in those works, you can go to the Byte Show and go to the library, click on Dr. Joseph P. Farrell's name, and his special page will open up where you can find the link right there at the top to purchase his theological works. Also, Joseph P. Farrell moved back to his home state of South Dakota, and he pursues research on his other loves and hobbies. That includes classical music. He is an organist. He plays the harpsichord, and he is a genuine composer of classical music. And I have had the pleasure of hearing some of Joseph's classical music. Don't laugh, Joseph. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And also his hobbies, if you can imagine, physics and alternative history and science and much other strange stuff. So, with our one and only Dr. Joseph P. Farrell, as you heard him snickering in the background. We're going to talk tonight. This will be in the Cosmic War section. This will be file number 14. And we're going to get around to talking about Roswell and the Nazis. And this is, Joseph, I can understand absolutely after reading your books why this cosmic war is the foundation.
Yes, it is.
It has to be read first. It has to be read carefully. And if you understand this book, The Cosmic War, you will better understand Roswell and the Reich.
Yes.
They tie together, and we're going to get into some of that tonight.
Right.
So, how are people getting their copies of Roswell and the Reich now?
Well, it's interesting that you should mention that. I've been kind of tracking it on Amazon.
Yeah.
And in the last couple of days, they have actually officially put up on their website that the book is now available. So that means that they probably actually have it in hand in their warehouses. So people can get it from Amazon, and therefore they should be able to get it, in the bigger cities and the Barnes and Nobles and
good.
Borders, and if not, those stores will special order it, or they can also go directly to the publisher, which for that book is Adventures Unlimited Press, and I think you've got that number up there on the...
Yes, it is 1-800-718-4514.
Right.
Yes, and Roswell and the Reich is being ordered at this time. And there was a huge pre-sale going on this, too.
Well, yeah, the book has seemed to have been spiking off and on.
Yeah.
I really have no idea why, but hopefully it'll do well, so...
Yes, and we won't have to stand guard at your house.
Yes, this is true, too.
You know what I mean.
I do.
Yes. So, Joseph, this is, in the Cosmic War, going way back, we've got these tablets of destiny.
Yes.
And it seems to me that these must be real when we look at what's happening. And there were also the tablets of, how do you say, Thoth?
The tablets of Tehuda, the Egyptian god, yeah. That name is spelled Thoth, and a lot of people pronounce it Thoth or Thoth, but it's actually Tehuda. The Egyptian language is kind of like Hebrew in that you have to apply the vowels. They don't actually all the time write out the vowels in the Egyptian hieroglyphics, kind of like Hebrew, so you have to fill in the vowels. So that's the name is actually pronounced Tehuda or Tehudi, some people will say, but yeah, that's
okay.
The tablets are they are the central focus of the Cosmic War, at least insofar as those ancient Sumerian texts go. The wars are fought because of them. They're fought by means of them. They obviously wield tremendous power, and certain gods are not supposed to have them. If you read the Sumerian text carefully, that I reproduce in that book, but they tablets of Tehuda are, I think, probably the same thing, or at least a similar type of thing. In other words, we're looking at, in ancient Egyptian mythology and ancient Sumerian mythology, I think we're looking at the same thing. They're described in slightly different terms in each tradition, but nonetheless, one thing stands out, and that is that they are these tremendously powerful technologies, and they are obviously a technology once you sit and read the text that I reproduce in that book. So yes, that they're very, very important.
Okay, another question about them. The possessors were not human as we understand human, and they were the ones that they seem to only work for males.
Yes, this is another very interesting, extremely interesting thing, and it's something that I've been noticing only recently. But if you read the descriptions of the tablets of destinies and who possesses them, the original person that steals them in the Sumerian pantheon is a goddess by the name of Tiamat.
Yeah.
But immediately upon stealing them, she turns them over to one of her allies, a Sumerian god by the name of Kingu. And every theft and recovery or utilization of them after that point in the Sumerian mythology, they are always wielded by masculine gods or male gods rather than female goddesses, which I think is a rather interesting thing. And it's the same case, incidentally, in the Egyptian texts with Tehuda, because, of course, Tehuda is also a male god. So it appears that, yes, we're dealing with real living beings, humanoid at least in their appearance, but nonetheless, in the case of these technologies, I suspect, and one of the things I mentioned in that book, is that there appears to be some connection that is necessary to activate the power latent in these things by being in physical contact with them or in close physical proximity to them in order for them to work. So this suggests to me that we're dealing also with some sort of kind of cybernetic technology that, you know, an interface between DNA perhaps and these technologies, whatever they were. So yeah, they're an endlessly fascinating,
yes.
they're an endlessly fascinating theme in all of these ancient texts.
Boy, well, could that be because of the chromosomal setup with the male?
It could be, but again, I think we have to be kind of cautious at this point in saying too much.
Okay.
I'm not entirely certain in my mind yet as to where all of this is going to go, but it could possibly be that. It could be some other things that I think might be in play here as well in the DNA that, you know, at this juncture I'm really not willing to say or even really to speculate. But
okay.
I can say with certainty that when you read the texts, and I have a whole chapter where I try and analyze what the Tablets of Destinies are in terms of possible modern scientific speculation about them.
Yes.
I can say with some certainty that they can only be wielded they appear to be wielded, as you say, only by male gods.
Male gods, yeah.
But the other thing is they either have to be wielded in actual physical contact with them, or they have to be wielded in close physical proximity to the god that is possessing them and using them. So yeah, it's like I say, they're an endlessly fascinating subject. They're kind of the central core technology.
Yeah.
That this war is fought over and fought by means of.
Do they have a relationship to the templates?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, good. Please expand. Please amplify on that.
Well, as you know, Chapter 9 of that book is the chapter that I examine what I think the Tablets of Destinies really were and why they were so important. And to explain what I think they were, and we may have covered this, it's been so long since we talked about the Cosmic War, I don't remember what I said or what I didn't say. But if you go to the Sumerian text, and if you go to a modern physics principle called phase conjugation, optical phase conjugation, that's the technical term for it.
Yeah.
And let me try to explain what that is.
Thank you.
Yes, optical phase conjugation just sort of leaves one hanging. You know?
Yes, it does.
But if you take a beam of light, like from a flashlight or a laser pointer or something like that, and shine it at an angle on a mirror, okay, the light will obviously be reflected off the mirror in the opposite direction, but at the same angle as the incident beam coming to it, okay? Now, that is not phase conjugation. What a phase conjugate mirror will do is it will take an incident beam and, so to speak, time reverse it and reflect that beam right back on the source. But the interesting thing is that as it does so, the laws of physics then are reversed. So instead of the inverse square law where you have light spreading out according to the inverse square law, what will happen is the inverse square law gets reversed. So the beam that is reflected back on the source is much more powerful than the beam that actually hits this phase conjugate mirror. Are you with me so far?
Yes.
All right. Now, what a phase conjugate mirror also does, and the reason they were invented actually was they came up with this idea, I think, personally, much previously to the public history of the idea. But the public history is that they came up with the idea during the Star Wars initiative under President Reagan, because what they were trying to figure out is how do we get a laser beam of enough power to go through the atmosphere and not be dispersed and refracted and so on and so forth by the atmosphere. And the way to do it was phase conjugation. And what you do is you shine several beams of light, you interfere several beams of light on a target object. and then that's reflected into a nonlinear medium, like a plasma, incidentally.
Yeah.
And that medium then mixes an outgoing wave, which is phase conjugated. What you're doing is you're taking a picture of the atmospheric interference, okay?
Okay.
And then you're shining a beam of light through that atmospheric interference using a grid or a grating or a template that is created on the phase conjugate mirror, okay? That's what the phase conjugate mirror is. It creates a template, all right? And then you shine a beam of light through it, and that template means that when the light is shined through that template, it converges on the target that the template is reflective of. Follow me?
Oh, boy.
Oh, boy, yeah.
Yeah,
yeah, that's a whopper.
Yes, it is.
Now, if you take that whole idea of phase conjugation, and instead of dealing with things like atmosphere and so on and so forth, if you're dealing rather with the physical medium of space-time itself, that's kind of a super phase conjugate mirror. In other words, you'd be taking little template things and compiling a catalog of basically every target in physical space. And with that template, then, you interfere a beam of energy on it, and bang, it hits that template and is directed to the target in a time-reversed fashion. And because of that template, again, it will converge on the target with much more power. Now, this is a long way around Harvey's barn to say that this is what I think the tablets of destinies were. They were kind of a catalog of these templates of all significant objects, planets, what have you, in local celestial space.
Yes.
And they were kind of, if you want to think of a phase conjugate mirror as a kind of a hologram that you shine a beam of light through, a laser light through, and of course that hologram then takes on a three-dimensional appearance, okay? Well, the tablets of destinies are kind of like these catalogs of holograms or templates. So in other words, they are tremendously powerful. They are kind of the software, so to speak, that makes all of that super powerful directed energy weaponry that I believe to have been in use in very, very ancient times. They are the software that allows you to target that weapon.
Okay. With that said, Joseph, could something like that be used for geophysical warfare?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Of course it could. Of course it could. All you would really need is, again, you would need to start compiling catalogs, tablets of destinies, quite literally.
Wow.
Of certain target regions and what their resonance is and so on and so forth. And once you have that template, then bang, you've got your ability to target that particular area.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely. This is kind of a super sophisticated version of Nikola Tesla's earthquake machine, if you want to think of it in that sense. So yes, it would certainly have a geophysical application. But there's one thing I want to point out, and it's very significant. The favored medium for creating these phase conjugate mirrors is a plasma, and particularly rotating plasma. Now, if this is beginning to sound like Nazi Bell and stars, because, what are stars? They're nothing but a big rotating ball of plasma, Now, this means that, in effect, a star itself is a potential phase conjugate mirror. So the nasty implication about this kind of physics is that any large rotating mass is a natural resonator of the kind of waves that we're dealing with here. So if you miscalculate, you can have resonance feedback effects on your home planet, on local planets in celestial space, conceivably in the sun. This is very, very, I've said this so many times before, but it bears repeating. This is very, very, very dangerous stuff, and you'd better know what you're doing before you start tinkering around with it.
Well, would I be totally whacked out if I Well, if I said that I kind of look at Haiti and Chile as being a tit for tat.
Oh, no, I don't think you'd be whacked out at all.
Okay.
In fact, I just did an interview, a short interview on another show on Thursday concerning the possibility that those two earthquakes were the result of a technology. And I think you can argue the case that they were by looking closely at the Chile earthquake, because what you have there is an 8.8 earthquake on the Richter scale. Mm-hmm. But what interests me is, and the reason why I think it may have been the product of a technology, is that if you remember the media, they were showing over and over and over again tsunami sirens going off in Hawaii and tsunami warnings in Australia and New Zealand and Japan, and they were expecting the worst.
Right.
And what happened in Hawaii, we got a whopping wave of a whole 2 to 4 feet in height, hardly a tsunami.
Right.
Now, and the same thing with Japan and Australia, which should not have been the case in an earthquake in a coastal area like what occurred in Chile.
Right.
Because, again, water is a nearly frictionless medium. Mm-hmm. And that means that, the inertia from the earthquake would have been transmitted very easily to the water and then across the ocean, and bang, you hit those coastal areas in Australia and Hawaii and Japan. But this did not happen. And that, to me, GeorgeAnn, is a clear indicator or signature of a technology that was in play to damp the inertial effects of that earthquake.
Intentionally damp it.
So that leads to the idea that possibly the earthquake itself may have been the product of a technology. And there's one other thing that I think is very significant in this regard.
Okay.
And that is that the earthquake took place in a city in Chile called Farrell.
Yes.
And that city is coincidentally very close to the old Nazi compound at Colonia Dignidad. And there still is a very heavy presence of, let's just say, post-war exilees in that area of Chile. And that area of Chile is right across the Andes Mountains from our good old friend, Dr. Ronald Richter, who was doing all sorts of nice things down in that part of Argentina. So in other words, if we want to look at that earthquake as the product of a technology, then I think a message was being sent back to the people sending messages with Norway spirals and, everything else that they've been sending messages. So I think we're looking at a very strong possibility that we're dealing with a kind of a covert earthquake war here between two factions that have possession of some really very nifty and gnarly technology.
Interesting name, Dr. Richter and the Richter scale. Another perhaps interesting synchronicity. Yeah. Oh, awesome. Well, when we look at Haiti, there were, on the other side of that island, there was hardly any damage.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And there were no gigantic waves, and there should have been.
Yeah, this is again one of the suspicions that I have about the Haiti earthquake is that there were, at least to my knowledge, there were not the kind of seismic ripple effects in the Dominican Republic, and there were no oceanic accompanying events. So again, taking the argument that I just presented with Chile, you extend it backward to Haiti, and it would appear that we're dealing with the product of a technology rather than a natural earthquake in the normal sense.
Yeah.
So.
And Chile has had ongoing, not just aftershocks, but fairly large quakes since then.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is I even put in right at the end of Roswell and the Reich. I put in some seismic graphs of what's going on in Antarctica.
Oh, yeah.
And the amazing thing to me, GeorgeAnn, is when you look at the graphs, I put in a seismogram of a normal Antarctica earthquake.
Yeah.
And then I put in a seismogram of another Antarctic event that appears to be some sort of explosion that was set off down there.
Was that before the big tidal wave that hit Indonesia?
That's a good question. I don't recall right off the top of my head. I can't really say.
Okay.
But the other interesting thing to me in the seismograms that I put into Roswell and the Reich is that there are seismograms of these enormously low frequency, ultra long wave activity stretching for hours going on in Antarctica. And again, I don't know of any geophysical model, really, that, to my mind, would adequately explain why you have this immense amount of activity stretching for hours of very, very long wave activity. The needles, you've seen the graphs, they're just all over the chart.
Yeah.
And these are very long waves, and they last for hours. And to me, this is exactly the kind of signature that you would get, I think, using some of this physics technology to produce them inside of the Earth. And that would be a natural place that you would want to do that sort of thing, because nobody's there other than, a few Russian stations and British and American scientific outposts. You could pretty much do anything down there you wanted to. So yes, I think we are looking at, to be quite honest, a kind of a covert war, using some of the technologies that I've described in the Cosmic War. And I want to say one more thing, and I meant to say this in response to your introduction, and that is, I think, your observation about where Cosmic War fits in terms of all my other books is absolutely correct. And that is exactly the way I intended that book to fit with all the other books. It's kind of, for me, I conceived of it as kind of the keystone in the arch that ties them all together.
Yes.
And I do want to thank you for making that observation, because it's absolutely correct.
Well, if you don't read the Cosmic Wars and understand that foundation, you get lost in these other books.
Well, the other books are able to stand on their own.
Yes.
But I did intend them to kind of move to the point of the Cosmic War and let people see that this is one and the same kind of physics that the Nazis were up to. And that's the reason why they classified that whole Bell project as war decisive. The A-bomb didn't even merit that classification from them, because, it was a mere pop gun by comparison to what you could do with this stuff.
Well, Joseph, where, and I know we don't like to speculate, but, we know that these very ancient ones had some kind of fantastic technology.
Yes.
So did the German scientist just kind of one day sitting there drinking his ale, in a pub somewhere, just sort of, it pops in his head?
No.
Or was this something that was progressive, or are they in contact with malevolent beings?
Well, there has always been a school of alternative research and thought, and I use the word research very lightly here and very loosely, that has argued that at some point in the period between the wars, much prior to when the Nazis took power, that there were these secret societies within the Weimar Republic, like the Thule Gesellschaft and the Vril Gesellschaft and all of these other German secret societies, that the claim has always been put out after the war that the Vril Society did in fact use mediums, psychics, and so on and so forth to channel some of this information. Now, The problem I have with that story thus far, and it's been around for a number of years.
Yes.
But the problem I have, GeorgeAnn, with that story is that it's coming out of the same exact circle of post-war neo-Nazis that were kind of based in and around Vienna. And they're the same group that's putting out this nonsense about Nazi flying saucers called Haunebu and Vril, actual field propulsion saucers.
Yeah.
That were in production in Nazi Germany in 1944 and 45. Well, there has never been a shred of proof that the Nazis were working on those types of saucers. Okay?
Yeah.
They certainly were working on flying saucers. Let me be very clear about that. They certainly were. But when you dig into that story, they were working on just basic kind of very advanced versions of jet aircraft was what they were trying to do with them. They were not to the point, in my opinion, of developing an actual practical field propulsion technology, although with the Bell project, that's obviously one of the implications of that project. But the war ended before they could make it a practical technology for propulsion. But the other thing I think we have to go to is that within the period between the wars and then once the Nazis take power, you do have within Germany a philosophical and scientific ferment that is thinking through physics and engineering problems in a radically different way than what we are accustomed to thinking of them now. And particularly once the Nazis take power and the SS is established as an organization within the Nazi state, as a bureaucracy within the Nazi state, you have within that bureaucracy certainly a culture, an ideological culture, that is fueled by all of this esoteric and ancient lore. And when you couple that with the scientific type of thinking that the Germans were doing in between the wars, and not just the Germans, there were other people doing it, but the Germans were certainly out in the forefront and had the most people doing it. When you couple all of that together, I think, yes, the ferment was there, and all it took was a regime that was willing to invest serious money and manpower into the research, and of course the Nazis certainly were. So, it was there, it was present in German culture, and even philosophically you can look back to some of these physics concepts. You can look back to German philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Arthur Schopenhauer as coming up with some of the ideas that would ultimately lead to the type of physics that they were tinkering around with in the early 20th century. So it's a very long and old German tradition to look at things in a certain way. So I think you're right. I think we have to look to an esoteric origin. And of course, what I'm getting at here is, and I think this is where you wanted me to go. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Germans were some of the world's leading Assyriologists. In other words, people that went in to Mesopotamia and dug up cuneiform and interpreted these old tablets and so on and so forth. And of course, as recent as Saddam Hussein's regime, he had a bunch of German archaeologists in Iraq digging up all of these things for him and cataloging them and so on and so forth. The German interest in the region has been profound, and it has been consistent for at least the last 150 years. So, yes, I think when you couple that German activity in that region of the world with what they're doing under the Nazis, I think there's a definite connection.
Well, yes, exactly. That that makes sense. And didn't something come out, Joseph, that a lot of those antiquities came up missing?
Oh, well.
you know.
Yeah, well, the Baghdad, I think you're referring to the Baghdad Museum looting.
Yeah.
I have always maintained, and it's kind of a friendly running feud between me and a couple of other authors in the alternative research field, because there are those who believe that the United States went in there, into Iraq, with the express purpose of recovering some of these ancient tablets and learning as much as possible, which, in fact, I think we did. But those people go on to say that we kind of staged the Baghdad Museum looting and then pretended to recover a bunch of stuff while we kept the really cool stuff, okay?
Yeah.
But my take on it is completely different. I think that if there are fingers of blame to be pointed at any one particular nation that would have been able to pull off the looting and to do it in a way that made us look responsible and left holding the bag, that it was probably the Germans that did it. And the reason why is there are still, to my knowledge, somewhere between 80 to 100,000 missing cuneiform tablets.
Yeah.
What the Marine Colonel, Colonel Bogdanov, I think was his name, or Bogdanovich, I forget which, this Marine Colonel, American Colonel, that recovered much of the looted material from the Baghdad Museum, most of what he recovered were the artworks, okay?
Yes.
But the cuneiform tablets, you read his book, he makes absolutely no mention of them. So in other words, my suspicion is that they're still missing, and we don't really have a good clue as to who did it or why. My guess is, given the fact that the Germans were the ones digging up these sites for Saddam Hussein, they were the ones keeping the archaeological field catalogs of what they were finding.
Oh, yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
So if anyone had a clue as to what exactly had been found, it was the Germans. And therefore they would have known where in that museum to look. And the final little bit of icing on the cake for me that points the finger to the intelligence services of that country, and very possibly France as well, is that it was German media, Der Spiegel magazine, in fact, that first broke the story of the Baghdad Museum looting in the context of witnesses having seen American soldiers going into the museum and carrying out a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's a simple matter for any country in the world to pick up some American uniforms and sneak their own people in and have people thinking, well, it's a bunch of Americans stealing all of this stuff.
Yes.
And then pin the blame on us while they get away with the goods. So, my guess is that while we may have tried to go into Iraq and recover some of this stuff, I think the bottom line is you have almost a century of very heavy German presence in that region of the world digging up archaeological sites. Most of the major archaeological discoveries in that country in the last century have been made by German and British archaeologists. In fact, it was a German archaeologist, Robert Koldewey, that actually dug up Babylon. So, you know.
Yes.
All of this is, to me, consistent with the interest of that country in Iraq.
Well, it's interesting also, Joseph, that publicly available books on these cuneiform tablets are not readily available. It's like Noah Kramer. Those books are about the last of the, I think, good books that I got a hold of.
Well, the other problem that you're dealing with cuneiform tablets is just buying catalogs of what's available. The catalogs themselves are tremendously expensive.
Yes.
And, because there's so few of them printed. So, in other words, you pay $150, $200 just for a catalog of what is in this particular collection at the British Museum or that particular collection. So, yes, it's very, very difficult. And just in my opinion, GeorgeAnn, it's too suspicious that too little of these cuneiform tablets have been translated.
Exactly. That's what I was. You said it. You took the words out of my mouth. Yeah. To go into a book search or a bookstore,
right,
and try to find any really scholarly works on these things, it just is almost it's non-existent. Just.
Yeah, it's very, very frustrating.
Yeah.
Stephanie Daly published a nice collection of Sumerian and Babylonian texts that were translated into English called Myths from Mesopotamia, and that's one of the standard academic translations that I use in the Cosmic War, the other one being Thorkild Jakobsson from Yale University and his collection of texts. But those are really the only two good academic collections out there in the English language, but there's so much more that needs to be done.
Oh, yeah. You're not kidding.
Yeah.
Yikes. Well, I wanted also to ask you, the version of Genesis, the Torah,
right,
the first 5 books, when were those? How do those books fit in relation to their Babylonian captivity? The timeline.
Yeah, there are. Oh boy, that is a really good question, and it's a really long answer.
Fire away, dear man.
There are essentially two schools of thought or two approaches to that question, and I'll call them the conservative approach and then the liberal higher critical approach.
Okay.
The conservative approach has always been, that promoted predominantly by Protestant scholars, to a lesser extent some Catholic scholars and some Jewish scholars, that the Torah was indeed composed by Moses himself, and that it was composed more or less right after the Exodus, all right? Now, there's the first big problem, because there are essentially two dates that scholars have always been debating, but if you study biblical scholarship, have been debating back and forth for years and years and years. And one is a fairly late date for the Exodus, circa about 1250 BC, and there is an earlier date for the Exodus, circa 1460 to 1475, somewhere in there, BC. Now, recently there has also grown up a very, very serious revisionist chronology in Egyptology, which suggests that the Exodus may have happened even earlier than 1450. Okay, so that school of thought places the Torah and its origin much, much earlier than the Babylonian exile, which was, of course, in the 6th century BC. So that for that school, it's not really even true to say that the Torah has anything to do with the Babylonian exile. But when we turn to the higher critics, a certain kind of biblical scholarship, in other words, that emerged beginning in the late 18th century and then continued all through the 19th century, there is a formal academic theory within biblical studies that's called the documentary hypothesis. It's also known by the names of two of the German scholars that kind of put the finishing touches on it. It's sometimes known as the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis, and then sometimes it's also known as the JEDP theory. Okay? Now, those 4 letters, J, E, D, and P, stand for what scholars believe were the 4 documents from which the Torah was eventually composed. And they believe that process of composition lasted over centuries. Okay? so that the Torah did not emerge into its final form until right about the time of the Babylonian exile, a little bit before, and then for some scholars even during the Babylonian exile. So you have a completely different chronology that has been put forward by those people in the last 200 or so years. And the order of documents that I listed for you, the J, E, D, and P,
yes.
those letters stand for the Yahlist document, which is the Hebrew name for God, Yahweh. The E document, that stands for the Elohist document, where the word Elohim is used for God. Mm-hmm. The D document is the Deuteronomist document. In other words, these scholars believe that the book of Deuteronomy was basically kind of a fake composition that was composed by King Josiah and his court and then placed into the temple where it could be discovered, which is what these scholars argue happened in the 6th century B.C. And then the final document, P, that stands for the priestly document, which was the final codification of all those laws that eventually become the Torah. Okay? So in other words, they're thinking that the Torah was not the composition of Moses. It certainly was not composed in its final form that we have it today in the period of the Exodus. They believe that there were several people involved in the composition over the centuries, and then one or two editors put it into its final shape. Mm-hmm. So you have basically two very, very opposed schools of thought with two very, very different chronologies. Now, the interesting thing, putting it into context of your question, it is only in the context of the documentary hypothesis that you get any sort of possible connection to Babylon and its possible role in the influence of the composition of those 5 books. So, we're in this is a debate that I can assure you has been going on in biblical scholarship for the last 200 years. Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Most of the churches now, the mainline churches, have adopted some version of the documentary hypothesis in their official Bibles that they publish, because you'll find, the Catholic Jerusalem Bible and so on and so forth, or the New Revised Standard, these different new versions will have their editorial notes. If you read them carefully, you will discover they're based on some version of this documentary hypothesis. Evangelicals, on the other hand, have completely avoided that type of biblical criticism and are in fact opposed to it. So, this continues down to our own day, and it even shows up, the influence of these opposing viewpoints shows up in the translations that each advocates.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, this, we could talk on this for hours.
Yes, we could. Yes, we could.
Because, it's like someone has an agenda, And,
well, yes, I we've discussed this privately, and I don't want to go too much in depth here in this interview, but my own opinion that I come to now is I personally have never been a subscriber to the documentary hypothesis.
Okay.
For a number of very picky reasons that we'd be discussing all night. If I were to try and explain my reasons, I'd have to really get into the nitty-gritty of that theory, and that would bore everybody. But yes, the bottom line is I do have the very strong intuition that much of the Old Testament biblical text is an edited text, but that the editing has not been done in the way that the advocates of the documentary hypothesis claim.
Yes, yes.
Because what they're saying is that the editing was all done in the name of a late emerging Hebrew monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
And that is as far as they take the agenda. I think that there are much more hidden agendas. I get into some of them in my books, or at least hint at some of them.
Yes.
With, the very peculiar alchemical readings of Moses melting down the golden calf idol that the Hebrews had made. There are some other things that you and I have talked about in this series, the Tower of Babel, and how that story is just kind of squatting there. You don't really know where it comes from. It's just plopped down in the middle of the text without much of a context by which to interpret it. And the other peculiar thing about it, as we've discussed before, is that there's no morality in play.
Yes.
In the story.
Right.
People have had the idea that there is, but, you can only get that idea by reading into the story at that point.
Yeah.
So its occurrence there has always kind of strongly suggested to me that there's some sort of agenda taking place in the editing of the Old Testament text.
Mm-hmm.
I don't subscribe to the idea that the higher critics do, that there were several editors over several centuries, because it looks to me that the editing was too consistent. In other words, it was a tightly controlled affair.
Yeah.
So that if there was more than one person involved, it had to have been people in close physical and temporal proximity to each other that had a consistent goal in mind when they did it. So that's kind of my take at the moment.
Okay.
And I don't want to get into more details of why I think these things at this juncture. It's just we're just not ready to go there.
Right. And we don't need boots on our doorstep.
And some of those things. I've discussed them with you privately, but
yes. I know. Well, when we go and we look at this grand assembly of the, how do you say it, the Anunnaki?
The Anunnaki.
Anunnaki, okay. They are, or are they not, the Sumerian equivalent of the Nephilim?
Well, yes and no. The term Anunnaki simply means those who came down. In other words, those who came down from heaven. I think you can make a bit of a case that the Grand Assembly of the Anunnaki, in other words, the Sumerian gods, is basically what you're saying, the Sumerian pantheon. And the principal players in that pantheon, is for people to kind of refresh their memory. There's the original primal god, who is a god named Anu. And then his offspring, which is Tiamat and Marduk, Ninurta, Nergal, Enlil, and Enki are the ones that are kind of the main players in this cosmic war scenario. Those are the gods that pop up over and over and over again.
And they're the ones that had the tablets of destiny.
And they're the ones that are always fighting these immense wars over and with the tablets of destinies. Until Ninurta comes along and finally reclaims them and destroys some of them. In other words, and then some of them he secrets away.
Yes.
Because in the text that I reproduce in the Cosmic War, because they simply could not be destroyed, which I find is a very interesting thing, because the alchemical doctrine of the Philosopher's Stone is that the Philosopher's Stone is indestructible. So again, you have from way back in ancient Egypt with the alchemical reference, and then way back in ancient Sumer with the reference to the indestructibility of some of these tablets of destinies. I think you're looking again at a common legend here that has been differently handed down in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Okay? We're looking at a fragmented science. And as I mentioned in the Philosopher's Stone, it's very interesting to me that the medieval alchemist Paracelsus comes right out and says that when that ancient lost science was fragmented, the Babylonians got the astrological component.
Yeah.
The Egyptians received the alchemical component. And the Hebrews received the Kabbalistic component.
Interesting.
Very. Now, let's speculate a little bit. I'm willing to go this far.
Okay. Because
I've said it before on your show. If you look at the Hebrews and you look at the Old Testament itself, it is constantly moving between what two cultures?
Yes.
Babylon and Egypt.
Yeah.
Right. Constantly back and forth between those two cultural epicenters. So, if there's an agenda, it is interesting to me that the Hebrews seem to be wandering all over the place as if someone is trying to put back together that fragmented, lost science.
Wow.
And it's conveniently all being done under the guise of religion.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, if there's an agenda, my suspicion is, and just speculating here, my suspicion is that's it.
Wow. Oh, Joseph.
Yeah.
Well, it makes sense. It does make sense.
Yeah, it does.
You know, and the chart that you have in the Cosmic Wars.
Which one?
Well, there's several about this pantheon and their descendants.
Yes.
And in there, it's interesting, when you brought up the Tower of Babel, that Nimrod is associated with Enki in the Sumerian version.
Yes, that's right.
Oh, my goodness.
That's right.
My goodness.
Yes, when you read the connections that exist between this really was one of the things that hit me, like a thunderbolt.
Yeah.
When I started investigating all this, because of course in biblical studies, you are not really ever sufficiently familiarized with the potential Sumerian and Babylonian influence on some of the Old Testament.
Yeah, they want to hide that.
They want to hide that.
Yes.
And when you are exposed to it, you are kind of preconditioned, let us say, to interpret that possible influence in a certain way that appears to be rather harmless.
Appears, yes.
Yes. But when you kind of rinse all the academic filtering out of your mind and really look at what's going on, that's when it becomes very clear, at least to me, that there's some sort of editorial agenda going on. Now, having said that, I want to make something else very clear. If there's editing going on in the biblical text, the canonical text, then there is also editing going on in all the other texts from that region. So in other words, if you're going to compile a story, a revisionist history, so to speak, from Egyptian and Sumerian and biblical texts, then that's precisely what you have to do. You have to consult all of them and compare them to each other very, very, very carefully and in detail. That's the problem. And I don't think, and I'll probably upset a lot of people here, I don't think the Egyptologists have done that adequately. I don't think the Assyriologists have done that adequately. And I don't think any stripe of biblical scholarship has done that adequately.
I would agree with that.
This is something that still remains to be done, at least publicly. I'm not saying that there may not be people that have done this privately.
Yes.
And kept it hidden and carefully out of sight.
Oh, yes, I know. I know. Yes. Well,
Well, you and I know who some of those people may be because we've discussed it.
Yes,
we've discussed
exactly.
it privately.
Exactly. You're going to have people tapping my phone, Joseph.
I don't mean to do that.
Well, you know, when we look, too, at dating systems.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. There's supposed to be, and you've got a photograph of this in the book, of an ancient shoe print.
Yes.
It's a shoe print,
yes.
not barefoot.
Right.
It's a shoe print
right.
in Nevada.
Right.
In in a rock.
Yes.
And it's claimed to be 213 to 248 million years old, Joseph.
Yes. Yes.
How can that be? How can they?
Well, you know, again,
and some guy on this planet wearing shoes that long ago.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's a bit of a problem for the standard academic theory of who we are and how long we've been here.
Yes, exactly.
This is the other part of the problem, is that you have all of these very, very old, out-of-place artifacts that are clearly the product of some sort of civilization that should not, by any standard version of human history, be there when they're there.
Right.
So, you know, and quite frankly, you know, I don't particularly care if academia writes me off as a crackpot or a kook, because quite frankly, academia isn't looking at these things seriously enough. They don't want to do that.
They don't want to rock the boat, Joe.
Well, they don't want to, they don't want to give up their grant money, and they don't want to, you know, there are institutions that are supposed to be for academic freedom, but they're anything but.
Exactly.
Particularly in this country. I mean, this country's academic institutions, I'll go on record and say, are just plain fraudulent.
Yeah.
When it comes to these types of questions and looking at them really openly and really honestly.
My God, Joseph, look what they did with global warming.
Well, yeah.
You know, lies, lies, lies.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, this dating thing, going back to Nimrod and Enki in the Sumerian version of the Tower of Babel, that was composed approximately 2000 BC.
Yes.
Okay. How do they? And that's older than the Genesis version.
Yes.
Okay. How is this done?
What do you mean? How is this done?
The dating.
You mean in terms of biblical scholarship?
Yeah.
Well, again, the problem of dating in biblical scholarship is that they've had to try to match the text with known archaeological discoveries. This is one of the biggest problems, in fact, with the documentary hypothesis, because when it was being formulated, many of the archaeological discoveries that we now know of did not back then exist. So in looking for some way to root the biblical text, what the critics were doing was they had to rewrite the history to make events fit what they believed were the actual things that did occur in history. So in other words, in a certain sense, the higher critics weren't trying to debunk the Bible any more than a conservative scholar was. They were simply trying to say, no, this is the actual history of what it's referring to. But the problem now is, I think, that if one looks seriously at the antiquity of some of the Sumerian versions of the biblical stories, what you're really looking at is, if you really are objective, you're looking at biblical versions of the Sumerian stories.
Oh my!
You see what I'm saying? If the Sumerian story is earlier, then the biblical version is perforce, by the nature of the case, a version of an original. So the question is, why did the biblical text alter the original version? What is the agenda in place
my question exactly.
Yeah, well, again, I don't have the answer to that question. I suspect, again, that if we take this speculation of mine, that the Hebrews are moving back and forth between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and eventually, settle in the land that is exactly between the two.
Mm-hmm.
That the reason for this is, in fact, political and may have a hidden technological agenda of trying to put back together a lost science, a lost technology.
Yeah, that would sure beat wandering around and living in tents.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, there is something, I'm not trying to denigrate the religious aspect of things by any stretch of the imagination, but what I am suggesting is we had also better take seriously into consideration that there may be other motivations in play that are carefully hidden.
Right. Do you think that, okay, with this ancient technology, and you talked about, this phase conjugate business.
Right.
Okay. Could that set up a galactic communications grid?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, one of the sources that I use in that particular part of the book that you're referring to is a physicist by the name of Dr. Paul LaViolette.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. LaViolette's book is called The Talk of the Galaxy. It's a wonderful book, and I urge people to buy it and read it, because what he discovered when he was studying an astronomical phenomenon known as pulsars was that pulsars, incidentally, are just kind of stars that are rotating fast, okay?
Yeah.
And as they rotate, they appear to send out these bursts of radio signals that occur with a regular frequency, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But now what's interesting to Dr. LaViolette is that these pulsars are not, and I repeat this word, they are not randomly distributed in the galaxy. In fact, they seem to be clustered at 1 degree off of the galactic center in the constellation of Sagittarius, and they would only be visible, or in other words, non-statistically random, from planet Earth.
Wow.
So in other words, it appears that somebody set them up that way.
Kind of, yeah.
As quite literally, as a galactic communications grid with specific reference to planet Earth.
Wow.
Yeah. So, when a serious physicist comes along and says something like that, you'd better stand up and take notice, folks.
You better, yeah.
Yeah, you'd better.
Well, could that be, many times, Joseph, throughout the Torah, as well as the New Testament, as well as holy books from other peoples on this planet, they mention that God told them this, or they spoke with their deity, whomever. Could that galactic communications thing have something to do with that?
Oh boy, GeorgeAnn.
Oh, my mind's on fire right now.
Yes, I can tell it is.
Oh. And I know you can't say yes or no, but can we explore that?
Let me put it to you this way.
Okay.
That is such a good question that I can answer part of it now.
Okay.
But I think once Babylon's Banksters is out and you read a certain portion of that particular book,
oh dear,
and discover what it is,
oh my gosh,
what it is that some of these ancient temple money fraternities are up to, you're going to absolutely be floored.
Oh.
But the short answer is, could that grid have been used to fake religious experiences?
Yes.
Short answer, yes.
Oh my gosh. Ooh.
Yes. Because, let's go back to our longitudinal electroacoustic waves in the physical medium, okay?
Yeah.
Remember my analogy of jump rope waves and yardstick waves?
Yeah.
And let's repeat the analogy so that people understand what we're talking about.
Oh, please.
Normal electromagnetic energy, the radio waves that you listen to in your car,
Yeah.
those are jump rope waves or Hertz waves or sine waves, okay? So if you have two people stand up and sort of loosely stretch a jump rope between them, and one person jerks the jump rope up and down, okay?
Yes.
Most of the energy of the wave that is transmitted to the other person is lost in the up and down motion of that wave, okay?
Okay.
That is normal electromagnetic energy that travels at the velocity of light. With me?
Yes.
Now, instead of stretching a jump rope between the two people, now put a yardstick. Okay? And have one person pulse that yardstick repeatedly. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
All of that energy is transmitted to the other person instantaneously.
Oh my gosh.
So in other words, if you extrapolate from the analogy now, that longitudinal or pulsed wave, that's what a longitudinal wave is. It's a pressure wave, just like a sound wave in the air or a sound wave in water. That's a longitudinal wave. It's a pressure wave.
Okay.
Well, a pressure wave in the medium, by the nature of the case, GeorgeAnn, is superluminal. In other words, it travels faster than the velocity of light.
Yeah.
Okay? So that is the way. If you're going to set up a really good, efficient way of communicating with people far distant from you, the way you're going to do it, you're not going to use Pony Express, electromagnetic radio waves or television. That's going to take forever to get there.
That's pretty antique.
It's obsolete. It's an antique.
Yeah.
So what you're going to do is you're going to have some sort of communication system based on longitudinal waves, pulsed waves in the physical medium itself.
Yes.
Or as they're known in some of the physics literature, scalar waves, all right?
Okay.
The interesting thing is I made a little discovery. Actually, it's not my discovery. I discovered a man who made the discovery.
Okay.
Of a very interesting ancient application of scalar waves. So could some of these religious revelations and so on have been, so to speak, faked or hoaxed on people? Short answer, yes.
Oh my. Well, Joseph, you remember during Gulf War I?
Yes.
All those people that threw up their arms because Allah told them to give up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Brain-to-skull technology?
Well, yeah, there are so many applications of this stuff, it's not even funny.
Oh.
It's not even funny. There are so many applications of it.
Yeah, the news is full of them if you know where to look.
Yes, the news is full of them if you know where to look and how to look.
Yes.
The how will tell you where. But yes, it is a breathtaking technology. And, I'll probably be writing about it until the day I die because there are so many different applications, so many different possibilities. And particularly so when you take these modern discoveries and go back and read some of these very, very ancient texts, because it's very clear once you do that, they are describing this in detail. In the Giza Death Star destroyed, I take some of those old Sumerian texts and do that.
Yes.
And the amazing amount of parallel between the Enuma Elish, for example, and descriptions of some of the signatures of this scalar technology are just mind-boggling.
Oh, yeah. it's unbelievable that,
yes, it is.
And everything seems to have been at one time without form and void.
Yes.
And then whammo.
Yes.
And then there's another whammo.
Yes.
And they're telling us now there's going to be another whammo.
What do you mean?
Well,
who's saying that? With regard to what?
Well, there's this hysteria that the end of the world is coming again, with this Planet X coming near.
Oh yes, the Planet X and the 2012 stuff and all of that.
Yeah.
Well,
and Joseph, I can see how it would be of benefit to certain people that all of us believe that.
Oh yeah, there's definitely money to be made in promoting the apocalypse. I'm not an apocalypticist, as you know.
Yes.
I have no time for dispensationalist theology that the American evangelical community is into. I have no time for that.
Yeah.
And I have no time for the sort of apocalyptic doom and gloom mongering that is taking place with respect to 2012 and some other things, Planet X, in the alternative community.
Well, doesn't that increase the violence of the negative template, if you will?
Well, yeah. This is the other thing about this physics. There is a direct interface between consciousness and the physical medium, and I'll repeat that so people will understand what I just said.
Okay.
There is a direct interface between consciousness and the physical medium, so that to a certain extent the medium itself will respond to a lot of negativity by producing negativity.
Yeah.
So, I'm not a doom and gloomer for that precise reason. If you keep thinking negative vibes and the world's going to destroy itself, it may very well do that.
Yeah.
It's high time that we realize that we are not passive players in this story.
That's right.
We are active ones.
That's right.
And if I upset a certain crowd of predestinarians in the audience, that's too bad.
Well, no, Joseph, there's been experiments run by numerous groups.
Yes, that's quite so.
Where someone is, something's going to happen, okay?
Right.
And numerous people know about it in advance, and they focus on it with, shall we say, good thoughts, positive thoughts.
Yes.
And that whatever it was that was so bad doesn't take place. It doesn't happen.
Yes.
Or the people involved in it are arrested, so it doesn't happen.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, it's amazing what the human mind can do if it just knows it can do it.
Yes, yes. It's the old power of prayer paradigm.
Yes.
It's high time to start combating evil and evil people with the weapons that we do have available.
That's right.
And that's, number one, prayer, or if you don't pray, then think good thoughts.
Yeah.
And quite literally bind these evil people and their own plans so that they go nowhere.
Yeah.
I'm just not a doom and gloomer. For that reason.
Well, I think every day that we have is a blessing.
Yes, it is.
And we should react that it is a blessing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thankfulness is one of the key, I think, components of a genuinely humane human spirit.
You bet.
Because that requires a certain amount of humility before God or before the universe or whatever it is that you acknowledge as some sort of higher power.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's God. But there are people that don't have that, but are nevertheless good and decent people.
Yes.
So, it's high time to quit pinning labels and hating someone or disagreeing or nitpicking and fighting over stupid stuff, silly stuff.
And, you know, in the scheme of the universe, all that silly stuff is so meaningless.
Yeah, well, it's silly.
Yeah.
That's why it's silly stuff. It's meaningless and silly.
Well, I've got another question.
Mm-hmm.
With all of this ancient stuff, you
Yeah.
know, the technology that we believe that existed, and there certainly seems to be substantial documentation that it did exist.
Right.
How does all of that fit in with, say, Roswell and the Reich? And you mentioned a power plant, a neutronic engine. Idiots don't build things like that.
No, they don't.
And, that the Nazis were storing massive amounts of thorium.
Yes.
Okay, so how do we come forward and fill this in, Joseph?
Well, the whole physics of this Nazi Bell project that I've been kind of cataloging and documenting throughout these various books.
Right.
That whole physics is one and the same physics as this ancient stuff with phase conjugation and rotating plasmas and so on and so forth. All of that physics is bound up in detail in this Nazi Bell project. That's why the project fascinates me. Because what it indicates to me is that the Nazi state is, as it were, kind of a resurrection, a conscious and deliberate attempt to resurrect the technology of Atlantis, for want of a better expression. So the Roswell incident, the documents that you're referring to there with the neutronic engine, are a set of Magic 12 documents that are called the Cooper-Cantwell documents. Now, the problem with those documents is, in my opinion, that they are probably forgeries. They're hoaxes. But, like so many of those documents that have come out, they appear to have been constructed by somebody in the know. In other words, they're not complete nonsense.
Yeah.
There are grains of truth in them, so that you have to subject them to interpretation. Excuse me. Now, you also mentioned the Nazis and thorium, and that's a really good thing. That's a wonderful detail to pick up on, because when the Allied intelligence teams went into the Third Reich at the end of the war, trying to sniff out the actual state of progress of the Nazi atom bomb program, excuse me.
Yes.
One of the mysteries that has persisted to this day is we have no explanation for why the Nazis were stockpiling massive amounts of thorium. None. By the conventional physics and thinking of our intelligence teams and engineers that went into the Third Reich, they just could not figure out what in the name of sense were these Nazis doing with all this thorium.
Yeah.
And the Nazis themselves, after the war, the neo-Nazis put out this story that, well, we were just exploring its possible uses in a toothpaste as a whitening ingredient. Now,
Are you kidding?
No, I'm not kidding you.
Oh, my gosh.
That was actually put out.
Oh.
And I know, I don't know about your listeners, but I know that I don't want to be brushing my teeth with thorium.
No, I don't think so. Good grief.
I won't have any teeth by the time. But anyway, I think that in actual fact, and I write about this in The Philosopher's Stone, that the Nazis had a very sophisticated technology of isotope separation, and that technology is called laser isotope separation. In other words, you have to have lasers to make this technology work. And the technology is based on a tunable gas laser. In other words, the lasing cavity is not a crystal, it's a gas. Okay? And the gas has to be chosen to be resonant to the kind of isotope that you want to separate. And what you do is the lasing cavity, the gas that produces the laser beam, is of a certain frequency that is resonant to the isotope that you want to separate. And then you take that chemical element of the isotope that you want to separate, and you gasify it, and you beam the laser beam through that isotope with an electrical polarity. And what that does is it collects the isotope that you want on electrical plates of the opposite polarity. It's a very, very efficient way of collecting very pure isotope and in great amounts. All right?
Wow.
Now, what I think the Nazis were doing is that they were separating thorium-229 isomer, and an isomer is one of these isotopes that's in a high state of spin, okay?
Yeah.
And it's also got a very low threshold of stability, all right? Now, what that means is when you de-excite that isomer, in other words, you slam on the brakes and force it to stop spinning, the isomer will spit out massive amounts of energy in the form of gamma ray bursts, and it will slow down, it'll stop spinning, and in some cases it'll even fission spontaneously. In other words, you have the same principle at work in an atom bomb, but you are doing it by slowing it down, by pulsing it, making it stop, okay?
Yeah.
And then the atom splits. Well, I think they were using this thorium-229 isomer as one of the compounds in that serum-525 in the bell.
Oh.
Because we do know that thorium oxide was one of the components of that serum. So in other words, it's natural that they're going to spin all this stuff up using an element that's already in a high-spin state. Okay?
Yes.
So let's go to Roswell. All of what is taking place inside the Nazi bell is to put a plasma into a very high state of mechanical and electrical rotation, and then you pulse it. And then, of course, if you remember the bell story, people saw this thing levitating at night over the tree lines of the facilities where it was being tested.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So we have this crash in Roswell, which I do not think was extraterrestrial.
I don't either.
And I don't think it was a balloon.
Yeah.
Okay?
Obviously it was not a balloon.
Obviously it was not a balloon. If it was a balloon, then at the time the U.S. Air Force is in a whole lot of trouble because the intelligence officer of the only atom bomb group in the U.S. Air Force, or the rest of the world at the time, goes out and misidentifies a weather balloon as a flying saucer. So this is not the kind of man you want to have as your intelligence officer in that unit. In other words, the story that the Air Force put out the same day that it put out the flying saucer story, that it was simply a mistaken case of misidentifying a weather balloon, that's nonsense.
Oh, boy.
Their intelligence officer simply is not that stupid. You know?
Exactly.
So I look at it this way, GeorgeAnn. What crashed there at Roswell, as we mentioned in the other interview on Roswell and the Reich, was Nazi. And when I say it was Nazi, I don't mean that it was the product of some Nazi technology that we brought back to this country, and that our Nazis were running for us. No, no, no. What I mean by Nazi is it was the crash of something that came from an independent Nazi project.
The people with no telephone numbers.
The people with no telephone numbers and no addresses that live in Latin America.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, maybe down there around Concepcion.
Yes, maybe down around Parral, Chile, and San Carlos Bariloche in Argentina, you know.
Oh, my.
Yeah. If that's what happens at Roswell, that is going to send the United States military into a tailspin of panic.
Of course.
Because this is 2 years after the war. It is self-evidently a German technology, and when you read Roswell and the Reich and go through all the little details of the debris and how I trace them back to Nazi Germany, that pretty much, in my mind, cinches the case. And that E.T. and balloons came along as the way that the military tried to spin it so that people wouldn't realize that, hey, we've got a bunch of Nazis flying over over American airspace. Because had that got out, obviously there would have been a political outcry.
Well, there must have been something, Joseph, that they did to have, have them there at Holloman. And to me, that's fascinating.
Who was a German?
Yeah.
At Holloman?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that's related to the Roswell story or not. Quite frankly, nothing in this world would surprise me anymore. It all seems to be connected somehow.
Yeah.
But in terms of the Roswell incident, I think it's sufficient to the case that it is after that incident occurred, and no one, to my knowledge, before I came along with Roswell and the Reich, no one in the Roswell research community has pointed this fact out.
Yes.
That after the Roswell incident occurred, for some reason, most of those paperclip Nazis had their files reopened by American counterintelligence.
Oh, my.
Oh, my is right. Now, to me, that tells me that there's a connection, that the U.S. military was worried about our Nazis possibly being involved in something much bigger than we had ever dreamed possible.
Oh, my.
Yeah. Yeah.
What, in all of this that's going on, Joseph, what are the Russians doing? I mean...
Mm-hmm. What you mean with this physics?
Yes, with this physics.
Well, interestingly enough, and I mentioned this in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, the Russians got some of the German radar scientists that were working on radar versions of phase conjugation at the end of the war.
Yeah.
Now, stop and just think what I just told you.
Phase conjugation.
Phase conjugation. The Nazis discovered this in 1945.
Oh.
Just as the war was ending. So the Russians took this team back to Russia and employed them for a while in very super secret Russian projects involving phase conjugation.
Yeah.
Which is, again, the very same physics that you'd be using to do things like producing earthquakes and so on and so forth. And, of course, the Russians had Dr. Nikolai Kozyrev, that I talk about in The Philosopher's Stone quite a bit, who came up with the idea that, okay, stars are not emitting enough neutrino energy for the thermonuclear version of stellar energy to be true. So what he's really telling you is that there's some other energy source at work in stars.
Wow.
And that's where the whole idea of torsion comes in.
Yeah.
And once you say torsion, you're right back to this whole idea of scalar physics and a physics that manipulates directly the physics of the medium. Because what are stars? They're rotating balls of plasma. And when you say rotation, you're saying torsion. What was the bell? It was a huge device to do what? Rotate plasma. So we're in the presence of one and the same physics. Now, interestingly enough, the head of that German radar team, his name was Dr. Richard Hellmann, an apt name.
Yeah.
This fellow, for some reason, ended up being released by the Soviets in 1955.
Uh-huh. Yes.
And he made his way from there to, guess where? Brazil.
Oh, yes.
Where he worked on a similar project for the Brazilians. And I find that extremely interesting.
Yes, it is.
Because if you look at the physics papers coming out of Brazil in the last 20 to 30 years, they are extremely interesting, and they're very avant-garde. They're sort of out of the mainstream.
Wow.
And the other interesting thing about Brazil is that it has a fiercely independent energy policy. Yeah. So I think there's good reason to believe that one of the players in possession of this technology is precisely Brazil. and the group of Nazis that were working very covertly for the Brazilian government.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We don't care about your politics.
Yeah, we don't care about your politics. We just want our toys.
Yes, leave us alone.
Leave us alone.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Joseph, fascinating, fascinating.
It really is. It's a huge story.
Well, is this applicable to the technology that they had way back there?
Well, yes, it's all one. My point over and over and over is that this is all one and the same physics. The physics I write about in the Giza Death Star is the same physics I write about in the Cosmic War, and it's the same physics as I write about in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. It's the same physics I wrote about in Secrets of the Unified Field, the Philadelphia Experiment, and the Nazi Bell, and the Discarded Theory. It's the same physics that I believe that this Richter character was investigating in Argentina.
Yeah.
It's the same physics that was, I believe, in use in whatever crashed at Roswell. It's the same physics that's part of this Soviet research that I detail in The Philosopher's Stone. It's one and the same.
And
it is the same stuff.
So the ancients had these physics.
The ancients, when you say ancients, I want to make sure that people understand. I don't necessarily mean that the Babylonians had it or that the Egyptians had it. What they had was a residue of it.
Yes.
That there was a pre-existing, much higher civilization.
Oh, yeah.
That had this stuff long ago. And the evidence that existed is in those ancient texts from those civilizations in that region. Because those texts are describing a war and a technology in a detail that Babylonians or Egyptians would not have known of had they not heard it from somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we read in mythology, this god threw his lightning bolts, and this one threw his thunderbolts.
Yes.
And, all of those stories are talking about some kind of technology.
In my opinion, yes.
Even the ones, Joseph, where the women were deceived. I forget. The mother of Heracles.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband was away somewhere at war or whatever, and she believed he had come back and conceived a child.
Right.
That later it was found out that it wasn't of her husband. It was someone who was identical.
Right.
And is this also, can we classify this as a type of technology? Or
classify what?
Someone being able to take the place of or look like someone else.
Possibly. Possibly.
Boy, that's scary.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, there are little indications of a technology in most of these mythologies if you choose to read them in that way.
Yeah.
In other words, if you choose to read them as containing a kernel of truth that has been handed down through generation after generation and possibly millennia after millennia. So, there is, I think, sufficient evidence in most of these ancient texts that there was a very old, very sophisticated, very high civilization with a very high science. And let's not forget Paracelsus' little observation that was fragmented into different components deliberately.
Yeah.
And that there was a deliberate attempt made to reconstruct it.
Yeah. Well, remember Paracelsus and his homunculus?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Very fascinating.
Yes, it is.
Joseph, thank you very much.
You are welcome.
And everybody, please visit P. Farrell's website. It is GizaDeathStar.com, and there is a PayPal button there. Please make use of it. And if you'd like to email Joseph, and you want your email read, in the subject line, use all caps, all capital letters. And his email is Vardas. It's V as in Victor, A-R, D as in David, A-S as in Sam, 3, the number 3, at AOL.com. You can find all of this contact information plus all of the audio archives that Joseph and I have worked on over time. If you go to the Byte Show, go to the audio library and click on Dr. Joseph Farrell's name, and his special page will open up with all of the audio files, his book information, everything is right there. So God bless everybody out there that's listening.
Yes.
And we will be back, God willing. There's so much more to talk about.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Joseph. Yes, indeed. And do get Roswell and the Reich, the Nazi Connection. That is available at AdventuresUnlimitedPress.com. The toll-free line to order Roswell and the Reich, the Nazi Connection, is 1-800-718-4514.
And only during normal business hours, please.
Yes, and what time zone are they in, Joe?
Central Time.
They're in Central Time in the USA. And this particular audio file is under Cosmic War, and it is file number 14. So, with that said, God bless you all. Good night.
Good night.
The Byte Show is sponsored by Deep Cello Coffee. Perhaps the best coffee on this or any other planet. The Byte Show is listener supported at thebyteshow.com.